Come on by and have a bite at the CrossRoad Diner, the place your spirit goes when it may be time to change direction. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the CrossRoads Diner. I'm Steve McCurdy. I'm your host. And today I've got a really good friend of mine on today. Reverend Bob Johnson has been a friend of mine since the early 90s, maybe in the 80s. When did you get there?
It was the early 90s when I first met you.
Okay. So we go way back. And we're very good friends. And so I wanted to have him on to talk about his journey and the choices that he made and the inner voices that he had to listen to. And so, Bob, let's talk about when you were growing up. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, which is about 20 miles north of Boston.
Okay. And when you were growing up, did you have an idea of what you wanted to do and be?
I went through all the stuff that little boys go through, be a baseball player, be a fireman, be a policeman. But my family used to have a vacation home on Cape Cod, and we used to spend our summers there. And it was not very far from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And for some reason, I just fell in love with that place. And so my first memory of whatever I wanted to do was I wanted to become a marine biologist and work at the Woods Hole Institute. And in fact, when I enrolled in college, I enrolled as a biology major with the intent of becoming a marine biologist. Now, you want to hear why I didn't do that?
That's right, because I know that's not the direction you ended up going.
That never actually happened, but it happened for sort of a year, my first year in college. When I discovered that I got seasick fishing, I rethought that decision to be a marine biologist.
Okay.
So that kind of intersects with another thread when I was growing up. My father quit high school to join the Navy during World War II. So consequently, he did not have either a high school diploma or a college degree. But he managed to get a job with the Raytheon Company, and he basically became a self-taught engineer and was very successful at it. And my whole growing up life, I can remember my dad telling me that when I grew up, I was going to be an engineer. Now, I'm not kidding when I say this is actually true. I was in my early teens before I figured out that he did not mean drive a train.
Okay, that's great.
Because I had no idea what an engineer was. I thought they drove trains, and that was fine. I can grow up and be happy driving a train. But eventually I'll find out that that's not what he meant. And in my first year of college, when I was a biology major, I was required to take a chemistry class, and I did very, very well in it. Enjoyed it, which not a lot of people can say, and did really well in it. So about the same time I was figuring out that I was probably not cut out to be a marine biologist, and I was rethinking what am I going to do with my life? Well, Dad wants me to be an engineer. I did well in chemistry. It turns out there's a thing called chemical engineer. What do they do? I don't know. Can you get a job? I don't know. Can you make any money doing that? I don't know. But where do I sign up? And that's literally how I became a chemical engineer.
Talk to me a little bit about once you made this discovery that being seasick when you're on the water was probably going to interfere with that plan. What kind of grief process, if any, did you go through in making that pivot, or was it all pretty? Well, can't do that. Let's do this.
Yeah, I was making more of that. It's more, can't do that. Let's do this. Yes, and there was a lot in me. There was a lot when I was growing up. There was a lot in me of. And as a firstborn, this explains it a little bit. But there was a lot of let's make Dad happy, and not thinking towards what's going to make me happy. So, when one dream fell through, and there was another way to keep Dad happy, well, let's do that.
Okay.
Because Dad was paying for college, so
right. Well, yeah, I understand. Well, completely understandable. But it's interesting also that it wasn't. You didn't have something that you wanted to do that you were turning away from. It was like, okay, well, that's not going to work. So what And then this presented itself as, oh, well, I get to please him, and that's something I want to do. And I'm good at this, so let's put those things together.
Right.
So it was a choice that had a kind of a structure suggested to it.
But I literally had no idea what chemical engineers do. And I happened to come out of college at a time when engineering jobs, or chemical engineering jobs at least, it's very cyclical. And it happened to be at a time when it was difficult to get a job.
Oh,
But I didn't know any of that. I mean, I was just completely oblivious to all that. So I became a chemical engineer, graduated with a chemical engineering degree, managed to get a job with DuPont, got transferred, or not transferred, but they started me in southern New Jersey. I'm from Massachusetts. I moved to South Jersey, which, believe it or not, now I live in Texas. You and I met in Texas. We lived together here in Houston for a long time. When I moved to New Jersey in 1975, it was as far south as I'd ever been.
it's culture shock.
Yeah, it was real culture shock. But anyway, I went to work for DuPont, and I mean, I was just really fortunate. Given the way that I became a chemical engineer with no forethought other than pleasing Dad, I really enjoyed it. Not only was I able to get a job and it paid well, but I also enjoyed it. And I had a very good career doing it for 12 years. I started in South Jersey, met Susan, who's now my wife there. In 1981, DuPont said, hey, we have a great opportunity for you in Beaumont, Texas. And that's how we ended up coming to Texas, where we still are. So, for something that I just kind of backed into haphazardly, it really, really worked out well.
Right.
And Dad was very happy. Dad was very happy.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So you accomplished all those.
Well, this kind of feeds into my next story. But, from my dad's point of view, I was working for a Fortune 500 company. I had, a very solid job. My dad was a child of the Depression. So having a solid job, he had a father who drifted from one thing to another during that period. So for Dad to have a solid job was very important. Number two, I had a college education, which was something that he didn't have. And number three, I was doing something that paid well. So for him, I had achieved all his dreams for me.
Well, one of the things that we talk about on here is that many times this is the case, that your initial thought process is not some lifelong dream.
Right.
It is like, well, what am I going to do, and how am I going to make a living? And Mom and Dad want this. And in almost every case, I mean, surely there are those folks who have long-term traditions that they want to maintain and perpetuate, and it's very outside in. But in many cases, well, I would say in almost every case, it's born from that parental desire that you have a good life, that you, that you're happy.
Yeah.
And it comes from a place of love. Versus, no, this is what you're going to do because this is what we do. But at some point that changed for you.
Yep.
So talk to me a little bit about that transition.
So, as I mentioned, 1981, we moved with DuPont from South Jersey to Beaumont, Texas. We started, when I say we, I just mean my wife and I. There was just the two of us then. We started going to a Methodist church in Beaumont, and she had grown up active in the Methodist church. I had grown up sort of semi-active. My faith was not a really crucially important part to me when this was going on. Anyway, we were getting very involved in this church in Beaumont, and I was finding my faith. I was finding. I like to put it this way: Mom and Dad's faith became my faith during this period of time. Mm-hmm. And I was basically independent of, for their need of approval regarding matters of faith. And second of all, I was really resting my feet solidly in my own faith. Well, this eventually led to a call into the ordained ministry, which...
How'd that happen? We hear that word a lot, but how did that manifest for you?
So one day, the pastor of the church, this church had a senior pastor and two associate pastors who were part-time. And one day the pastor came to me and he said, the other two guys they're going to be out of town on this particular Sunday. Would you be willing to be the lay liturgist that Sunday? And I said, sure. I was actually the lay leader of the church at the time. So that Sunday morning, I got up and, I can't remember exactly what I did, probably read the call to worship and led the Lord's Prayer or something like that. And I sat down, and when the preacher, his name was Bill, when Bill got up to preach, he started off by saying, you probably all wonder what Bob is doing here today, whether he, quote unquote, ha ha ha, has answered the call. Well, this is hard to describe, Steve, but when he said that, I had this moment of it felt as if time had stopped and I was watching myself on the stage. And just it wasn't an audible voice. It wasn't anything like that. It was just a sense of pay attention to this. And then it passed. Like, well, pay attention to what? I mean, what is that supposed to mean? I don't know what that means. And the next morning,
was your heart strangely warmed?
Well, it wasn't even that. It wasn't even clearly a religious call. It was just the sense of time, the sense of perception was just different than it had been. Well, the next morning, so here I am left hanging for the whole rest of the day. What does that mean? The next morning, I used to get up early in those days and have a time of Bible reading and prayer and so forth. And during that time, the next day, then I heard loud and clear. What that was yesterday, that was a call to the ministry. I'm calling you to the ordained ministry. And this is literally true. My first response was, God, have you seen what my degree says? It says chemical engineer. God, have you ever heard a sermon on thermodynamics? It's not pretty. But anyway, that began a period of about 2 weeks, I think, at least 2 weeks, where this sense would literally not go away 24 hours a day. I would dream about it. It was present with me all day long. At the time, our plant where I was working was in the middle of a major startup of a new facility that was not going well. Headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware was calling every day, and there was millions of dollars on the line. And there was a lot of pressure to get this plant running. In the middle of all this, I'm thinking about a call to ministry. It would have been real easy to think about anything other than that, but I couldn't get it off my mind. Eventually, after 2 weeks, I got up the courage to tell my wife what was going on. Then I got up the courage to tell my pastor what was going on. And eventually, he kind of guided me into the process. Well, what do you do next? If this is what you think's going on, what do you do next?
Okay, and then from then to stepping into the process, we'll just talk a little bit about, was that commitment and clear all the way through, or did you have some waffling that you went through?
That's a good question. The sense of it was unmistakable. Okay, but that does not mean that I did not have questions or waffle, and particularly.
Okay, wait, hang on. Let's stop right there. Okay. So you knew the clarity of the call. You didn't doubt the call. What you doubted was your equality to the call, maybe.
Well, I doubted my quality to the call, and I doubted how I could possibly make this work from a practical point of view. So by this point in time in my life, I had one child already, and I had another one on the way. My wife, although always very supportive of this call, was nevertheless concerned that at the moment I told DuPont what was going on, they were going to say, okay, you're fired, and we'd lose our health insurance. And so she had that concern. So there was all the practical side of it. And once I discovered that I'm going to need to go to seminary, that's part of the process. How am I going to pay for that? Where are we going to live? How am I going to make enough money to get by while I'm in seminary with a family that's now bigger? So I had all those kinds of practical doubts.
Right. So how'd that work out?
Both good and bad. So this is the period I'm describing is 1987. And if you lived in Texas in 1987, especially if you lived in the Beaumont, Houston area in 1987,
Right.
you will know that that was a terrible time because oil had
Oil
crashed.
bust.
People were selling their houses and still owing the bank money. The real estate market collapsed. The job market collapsed. I mean, it was a horrible time.
PhDs were driving
Yeah,
taxis.
PhDs were driving taxis, and it was a horrible time to sell a house. And it's exactly the period of time I put my house on the market.
Hmm.
I put my house on the market in the fall, I think it was October of 87. Within a month, oh, and I made a deal with God, which I found out. God always has the upper hand when you make a deal with God.
Yeah.
You may feel like
Well, it's the house.
you may feel like an equal partner in the deal, but heads up, you're not.
Yeah. Well, you're betting against the house, which is not a real good position.
So I made this deal with God. If you'll help me sell this house in this horrible market, which I know is something you can do, God, because you can do anything. I will quit my job and I'll go to seminary and I'll become what you're telling me you want me to do. So put the house up for sale. A month later, the real estate agent calls and says, "Hey, we have a contract on your house." And at this point, I'm thinking, well, that's great. It's no big surprise because God made that happen.
Right.
And it was a lease purchase agreement. They were going to lease the house for a year and then complete the purchase a year later. Well, a year goes by, so I end up holding up my end of the bargain. I quit my job and I go to seminary, moved to Dallas from Beaumont and go to seminary. A year later, a real estate agent calls back and says, "Hey, I'm sorry, the contract fell through." What? I didn't even know that was possible. So now I'm stuck with this house.
Hmm.
Make a long story short, over the next 6 years, I had 13 contracts on that house. They all fell through except for the last one, which finally held, and I was able to unload the house. But all that period of time, on a student pastor salary, which is a bag of peanuts and two lawn chairs, I'm having to pay this mortgage on this house in Beaumont. And
Mm-hmm.
right now, as you and I are recording this, interest rates or inflation is the highest it's been in 40 years. Interest rates are climbing, mortgage rates are climbing. But just for perspective, my mortgage on that house in Beaumont was 16%.
Yeah. I remember those days.
Yeah. And I'm having to pay this, like I said, on a bag of peanuts and two lawn chair salary for 6 years. So
How did you do that?
So the sense of did you have any doubts? You darn right I had doubts, and God and I had a lot of conversations about this. But obviously now at this point I'm asking myself, did I misread this?
Yeah.
Did I have what did I eat that day? Did I misread the signals, or have I, even worse, have I done something since that would negate the call?
Mm.
And now I'm being punished for this. Because let me tell you,
Let's talk about self-doubt for a minute there, because you took a step in faith. You played Let's Make a Deal, which it's got its own. We could do an hour on that, but at this point, you as a human being and a man of faith are in a jam because your intention in your contract was, if you will cover me, I will take this risk.
Right.
And the cover me part went away.
Right.
So it's like, I think do I have to get into nitpicky detail? Did you not understand the intention of the contract? I would be, and a question you put to me when I was in the floor in a crisis one night is, I think you got a nature of God problem. Is God a straight dealer or not? And so talk to me about that.
Well, at the time that it was going on, I mean, it was a real crisis. Because literally my family was at risk. The continuing of my education was at risk. Everything was at risk. And so consequently, my faith was at risk. However, that sense of you're doing what I told you to do never went away. I had some doubts, but the sense of it never went away.
You had doubts about the how, right?
Well, like I said, I had doubts about whether had I misread this. No, you haven't. Am I being punished for
Right.
something? No, you're not. That was clear. Um, at the end of the road, when I finally sold the house and I was looking back, I was able to see that there was never a moment when I didn't have the house rented. So there was never a month when I didn't have income coming in to pay for. So while it felt really, really scary, and while I was always saying, well, what if I didn't have a renter? Um, it never happened. And I was able to
Right.
look back
Right.
and see that, God did cover the bargain, just not the way I expected.
He covered the deal.
Right. Just not the way I
Yeah, he covered the deal. What he didn't cover was he didn't let you in on it
Yeah.
a week ahead of time.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So you get through seminary. Where's your first assignment?
I was appointed as a student pastor. Well, no, I was a student pastor at Edom United Methodist Church, which is a little town of 250 people just outside of Tyler, Texas. When I graduated, and I was there all through seminary. And by the way, see, that's another way God covered us too, right? Because that student appointment, they provided a parsonage for us to live in. It was a very nice house, actually.
There you go.
And I didn't have to pay a dime on that. People in that community were always coming. There was a freezer in the garage. People were always coming by and putting in a side of beef or the latest haul of vegetables or whatever. I mean, we were not wanting for necessities. And again, it was, looking back, it was God's holding up his end of the deal, just not what I was expecting.
Next week, we talk with my buddy voiceover talent, Bob Darling, about his advice to his kids as they look at their own visits in the CrossRoad Diner.
So the advice that I've tried to give them, although I have always said that advice is worth every penny you pay for it, free advice, don't let fear rule your decisions first and foremost, right? Because that's what destroys most dreams, I think. So try to be fearless. And secondly, if something resonates with you, go there. Don't question it. Just do it. And it probably won't work out in the beginning, and you'll stumble a lot, and it may cost you some things, money, and maybe friends along the way. But that's okay. If you can do it with a partner, as in a lifetime partner, a wife or whatever, that's way better, because that support system is I think key.
You'll enjoy Bob's journey. And now back to Bob Johnson to finish up his story.
Okay, so I told you that I had basically achieved my father's dreams for me and went to college, worked for a solid company, got a good paying job. Once I made the decision that we were going to do this, and I knew I was going to have to tell my parents, I literally dreaded that phone call because I didn't know how my father would react. He did not react as badly as I thought he might, but I knew it wasn't going to be wholehearted 100% support. And I was right. When I called my parents and I told them what I was going to do, my mother's response was surprise, surprise, not surprised. But my father was basically asking, he said, can't you just be a committed layperson? I mean, do you have to give up your job? Do you have to? So he didn't, he wasn't real negative, didn't cut me down or anything, didn't say that's stupid. Someone else said that, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But he literally was struggling to understand why I would do this. And I think it was made harder for him by the fact that I had achieved everything he wanted from me. And now I was voluntarily giving all that up.
Right.
Now, the good part of that story, and then I'll come back and tell you about another family member, but the good part of that story is about a year later after that phone call with him, and now I'm a student pastor. I'm preaching every Sunday. We had just had our third child, a son, and mom and dad fly down from Boston to meet Eric for the first time, and it happened to be over a Sunday, and so dad came to worship, and he heard me preach for the first time. And we were sitting in my living room at the parsonage after worship that day. And Dad says to me, you know what? I think you're going to make a pretty good preacher. And that was, that was all the affirmation I needed. And from that point forward, he was nothing but supportive.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Now, I had a cousin.
Was he a man of faith?
If so, it was inward faith and not outward faith.
Okay.
He went to church every Sunday when I was a kid growing up, but it was pretty clear that he went because my mother wanted him to. My mother was real active in the church. He never really was. So I don't really know, and that's why I know that my.
So you don't come from a heavily churched tradition.
I come from a nominally churched background, not anti-church or anything like that, but it's basically it's okay with me if you do that, but don't expect me to do a lot.
Right. Okay, so. But then you had a naysayer. So tell me about that.
So I had a naysayer. I had a cousin. So I have 4 cousins on my dad's side. They're sisters. The oldest one married a pastor. So she's a pastor's wife. She is also the one, by the way, that set my wife and I up on a blind date. But that's a whole different podcast. So she's married to a pastor and has a couple of kids, and her oldest sister, is the one who is the naysayer for me in this story. She told me when she found out about it, she said, this is the worst decision you've ever made. You're going to put your kids' education at risk. You won't be able to afford a good college for them. And she's saying this based on the fact that she knows her father is helping to pay for the education of the sisters that's married to the pastor's kids. She's not just, this is not coming out of the blue. She says, but you're going to put your kids' education at risk, and therefore you're going to put their lives at risk. This is a terrible decision.
And how did you cope with that? And man, also, give me a read on Susan through this. Susan
was never anything but supportive. No matter how much.
That doesn't surprise me.
No matter how much the naysayers were. Like I said, the only thing, she never said don't do it. She just said, how are we going to pay for, if you lose your job, how are we going to pay for this birth that's coming up? And there's all kinds of other ways, too, that I could tell you if we had time about the ways she was supportive. But basically, she was very supportive. But basically, her support was, if you want to do this, if you feel like this is what you're supposed to do, if you feel like this is what God is calling you to do, we will do it. We will figure out a way to do it. And no matter what the naysayers say, we will figure out a way to do it. Now, back to the naysayer, because this has a good ending. Obviously, what she was saying was feeding my own fears, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Right? You know, what do I have a right to negatively impact the future, for my kids? Let me just fast forward to where we are today, and then kind of talk about how we got there. All 3 of my kids got a great college education. All 3 of them are still active in the faith. My oldest one is a pharmacist, has her doctorate. My middle one works for a faith-based agency, and my son is has a CPA. He works for a financial management firm. They're all doing very, very well. They were not gypped of a fine college education. Now, I will say that the state of Texas helped provide that education. They all went to state schools, but they all did great. They were doing fine. And my cousin, this is really a great ending to that story. So unfortunately, my cousin passed away in February of 2020, the one that said that. But prior to her death, she actually got herself back active in the faith. She actually bought one of my books that I've written for her whole Sunday school class to study.
Wow.
And ended up basically telling me that she was really proud of how my story turned out. And I preached at her funeral.
That's a wonderful button on that
I know it
story.
doesn't. They don't all have happy endings like that, but I'm
Yeah.
glad this one did.
No. Yeah. Me too. Me too. Let's talk about your books for a minute, because you served at Chapelwood for a long time. You were in other churches in my beloved East Texas area, but now you are, I would say, semi-retired to retired. But you've been writing a lot. Talk to us. Tell me your titles. How many are we up to now?
I think I'm up to number 15.
Oh my goodness! And these are all Amazon.
Yeah.
And Bob Johnson is what people search for an author.
The first book is called The Genesis Project: The Why of Discipleship.
Right.
And it came out of this was in 2012. I had been in the ministry for 25 years at that point, and I became aware that there were two nagging questions that were lurking in the back of my mind that I did not have good answers to. And I'm thinking, at 25 years into this, you really should know the answer to these two questions. And the fact that I didn't have good answers was bothering me.
Right.
The two questions were, what is the gospel? What is good in the good news of Jesus? And usually the answer that people give to that question is, well, Jesus died for our sins. But you only need the New Testament to come up with that answer. You don't need the Old Testament.
Right.
And I'm thinking, my Bible is like 75% Old Testament. What's the purpose of all that? Do I only need to read the New Testament? So I knew the answer to that question was no, but I knew that the answer to the question, what is the gospel, had to take account of the 75% of the Bible that a lot of people don't ever read. The second question was, of all the...
Well, and Jesus himself said that, I did not come to overturn the word,
Yeah.
So
My second question was, of all the things that Jesus could have said as his last words, why did he say, go and make disciples? There must be a reason. And again, that reason had to take account of the Old Testament. And so I had these two questions that I didn't feel like I had good answers to. I had the standard churchy answers, but I didn't have answers that settled Bob Johnson's soul. And so in 2012, I actually took a sabbatical, the only one I ever took in my life. And my sister and her husband had at the time had a condo in Hawaii, which they let us use for a couple of weeks. So I flew to Hawaii for 2 weeks and did the research that would eventually become this book that I call The Genesis Project, in which I set out to answer those two questions. And since then, the rest of the books are basically book by book Bible commentaries. So obviously, I got a lot more Bible to get through. I've only written 15, but I go through each book, book by book, and verse by verse, and I expound on how the Genesis Project shows up there. So I'm basically proving to myself that, yep, this really is deeply embedded in the Bible, and it goes all the way through.
Well, I'm not surprised that a scientific thinker would have a scientific approach to picking an idea apart like that. It's very, very traditional. I mean, very predictable that you would approach it that way, and I would be disappointed if you hadn't. But the nature of our show, Bob, is about validating your gut. When your gut says this is what you ought to be. I know that everybody else is saying this, but we're whispering in your ear about this. And how do you have faith in that when you've got a father that you love, who you believe loves you and wants the best for you, who is saying, no, go this direction? You've got a cousin that you love who loves you and is concerned about the future of your kids. Yeah. And they're speaking through their fears in many ways. How do you separate that out? When do you know that it's true for you?
I wish I could answer that easily. And I guess it just has to go back to the fact that I never doubted what I was being told to do.
Right.
And while I had questions And while things certainly didn't go the way I expected that they would go, while it for a long time, it didn't seem like God was holding up his end of the bargain, that sense of this is what you're supposed to do never wavered. And
Okay.
it was internal. It was not external signs that I could point to. And had that sense, I mean, I had the questions of, well, did I hear it right? And or has it changed? If the answers to those two questions had prevailed, I may not have been able to stick to it. But because I was absolutely convinced that that never changed, I was able to endure all the things that we went through. And then in the end,
What?
you look back when hindsight is wonderful. When you look back, you see things that you couldn't see while you were going through it. And
Right.
when I look back, I see all kinds of, confirmations of, this was the right thing. But at the time, I just had to trust this is what I'm supposed to do. And even when it didn't seem like that made any sense whatsoever, when all the signs seemed to be pointing in another direction, like you can't sell your house for 13 contracts. I would challenge anybody to say I've had more than 13 contracts fall through, and not give up. But that's what we did. We got through it. And then when I look back, I can see, but there was never a month that we didn't have rent. I didn't go bankrupt. Oh, and I didn't tell you, when I got to seminary, when I got to seminary, I got a scholarship. Well, I wasn't expecting that. That was great. The other thing is, in order to, one of the prerequisites to get into seminaries, you have to have had a class in philosophy. Because theology and philosophy, there's a lot of similarity in the way the thinking works. And I never had a class in philosophy. I was an engineer. Let's talk about thermodynamics or stoichiometry or calculus or whatever, but I never had philosophy. And they said, for a reason that I still don't know, they said, okay, we'll waive that. So, it would have been great if I could tell God, God, I tried to get in, but, they wouldn't take me. And so I'm going to go back to being an engineer now. But nope, that didn't work either. So there was stuff like that just kept me going. It just kept me going. But it was internal. If I lost the internal fortitude or conviction, I don't know what I would have done.
So let me see if I understand what I have heard. What I'm hearing is that you ran into a lot of obstacles that caused you to question your interpretation of what you had heard or felt you heard.
Yes.
But the conviction about the rightness of that never left you. It's just, did I do something wrong with it?
Every time.
But this is the thing.
Every time I asked the question, did I misinterpret? The answer was clearly, no, you did not misinterpret. Has the call been removed? Did I do something wrong? Am I being punished? Is that why I can't sell the house? No. And then
how did those no's come to you? How did you perceive those no's?
It's just in my spirit, Steve. And you would think that it would have been easy to hear, yes, you did, so you can give up. But it never went away.
So you had confidence that what you felt about what you were hearing was absolutely true for you.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. Well, we're completely out of time, and I want to do this again with you someday, maybe, and we'll talk about your books in a little more depth. But thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, sure.
This has been. I've known bits and pieces of your story. It's wonderful to get the whole thing. Tell folks where they can go to find your books and what they need to search.
So if you go to Amazon and you search for The Genesis Project and put in Bob Johnson, by the way, there is another book called The Genesis Project, and it has nothing to do with theology. So you probably don't want to read that one if you're looking for mine. Okay. If you put in The Genesis Project and my name, Bob Johnson, it'll pop up.
And then are able to find your other works through that link,
usually
right?
It'll show other books by this author.
Right. Thanks for being with us today, Robert.
My pleasure.
I love spending time with you. And for all of you who are new devotees or have been walking the walk with CrossRoad Diner, you will have doubts. There will be things that occur to you that will call things into question. And Bob's philosophy is ask the Spirit if this call is authentic, and then listen and try to get your bias out of the way, particularly when it's not what you expect to hear. But that's the challenge that we all face: is this real, or is this my ego? And so
And when
you look
the
like you got
journey
another
doesn't
little,
go as you expect it to go, the doubts,
right,
can flare up. But at some level, you have to have confidence that you heard it right.
right. And the other thing is, that you went on a path that you felt was right and right for you, that you loved and enjoyed, and that path took you to a place where you heard the next path.
Right.
You were an engineer, and on that path, which was rich and full for you, came another, and that's another characteristic. We don't get one assignment. We get assignments that take us to prepare us for other assignments.
Yeah, that's a really good point
and
too.
So, yeah. So until next week, this is Steve McCurdy for our friend Bob Johnson. See you next time on CrossRoad Diner. Come on by and have a bite at the CrossRoad Diner, the place your spirit goes when it might be time to change direction. If you've enjoyed the CrossRoads Diner and you think it's touched some part of you, look back through the episodes, find one that's your favorite, and share it with someone who you think might be at one of their own crossroads. It could be a person who's in financial trouble, a person who's in a family crisis, or someone who's been doing something for a while. They're good at it, but maybe now it's time to look at doing something more in line with their heart. Share us with them. It could be the very thing that they need. And we'll be back with you next week, right here on the CrossRoad Diner.